Let me just briefly recap as we're moving into the literary prophets, or the classical prophets are sometimes called. It's easiest to think of them as being associated with particular crises in the nation's history. We're not going to be looking at them all, and I've picked out some of the main ones that we'll be looking at, really. They're exemplary in a number of different ways. So you have prophets of the Assyrian crisis. This is when the two kingdoms still exist. So in the north, prophesying in Israel, you have Amos and Hosea. And in the south, you have Isaiah and Micah. So think of those four books together. It'll be easier to note the differences among them if you group them together, and we'll be doing that. Then the prophets of the Babylonian crisis. By this time, the northern kingdom has fallen. We're moving towards the end of the 7th century. The Assyrian Empire has fallen in 612. The prophet Nahum talks about the fall of Assyria. And we move then into the very end of the century and down to the beginning of the 6th century with the destruction of Judah. So prophets associated with that time, particularly Jeremiah and also Habakkuk. Then we have the prophet of the exile, who is Ezekiel. And then the post-exilic period, or the restoration, when the Israelites are allowed to return to their land. And we have several prophets at that time: Haggai, Zechariah, Joel, and Malachi will be the prophets we'll be looking at briefly. There are 3 long prophetic works: Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, one associated with each of the 3 crises. So again, another mnemonic for you is to sort of think of them, each associated with each of those major crises. And the rest are all much shorter works. I think Obadiah being the shortest, really just a very, very short work. There's been a long debate over the degree to which these classical or literary prophets were harking back to long-standing Israelite traditions, or constructing norms that would later come to be viewed as long-standing Israelite traditions. Kaufman describes these classical prophets as the standard bearers of the covenant. This is his term. And in his view, they could be seen as conservatives. But by the same token, he says, the new prophecy conceived of ideas that Israelite thought of the earlier time had not conceived. And in this sense, Kaufman argues they are also radical. He describes them as radical conservatives, or conservative radicals. As a result of the radical nature of some of their message, the prophets had to speak with great exaggeration, and you will notice this when you read their writing. Great exaggeration, a lot of dramatic imagery, dramatic features. They denounced the people, they chastised the people. And as a result, they were often scoffed at, or even persecuted in return. But eventually the nation would come to enshrine their words in its ancient sacred heritage, which is testimony to the fact that their message must have served a crucial role at some time in the changing political and religious reality. Now, we've already talked about the Deuteronomistic historiosophy and how it developed as an interpretation of the historical catastrophes of 722 and 586. And this interpretation made it possible for Israelites to accept the reality of the defeat of the nation, the defeat of Israel, without at the same time losing faith in God. The defeat of Israel, the exile of the nation, was not to be taken as evidence that God was not the one supreme Lord of history, or that God was a faithless God who would abandon his covenant and his people. The defeat and the exile were interpreted to affirm precisely the opposite. God, as the universal God, could use other nations as his tool. He could use these nations to execute judgment on his people, and he did this in an act of faithfulness, ultimately, faithful to his covenant, which promised punishment and chastisement for the sins of the people, the sins of idolatry.